I've been a diplomatic courier for 11 years. 11 years of carrying sealed data chips between embassies, of standing in hallways while species that could crush me without thinking argued over trade routes and territorial markers, of learning to make myself small and quiet and forgettable. You develop a feel for rooms after a while. You learn to read the tension in a space the way an old pilot reads weather, not from instruments but from something in your bones, some deep-wired instinct that says this place is dangerous even when nothing visible is wrong. The Grand Assembly Hall on Veyrath Station had that feeling the moment I stepped through the security arch. Veyrath itself is a neutral station. That's the whole point of it. It was built 3 centuries ago by the original Galactic Accord signatories specifically, because no one could agree on whose planet to hold meetings on, and the compromise was to build a station that belonged to no one and everyone simultaneously. The architecture shows that compromise in every detail. It's a strange layered thing, ring upon ring upon ring, each section designed to accommodate the environmental needs of a different species cluster. The outer rings are cold and pressurized for the Karathi. The middle rings are kept at standard temperatures for the carbon-based majority. The inner rings, near the station's thermal core, stay warm and dry for the desert peoples and the reptilians. The Grand Assembly Hall is in the middle ring, neutral ground, literally and symbolically. Standard atmosphere, standard gravity, standard light levels, or as standard as you can get when you're trying to accommodate beings whose visible light spectrum varies by about 300 nanometers in either direction. I was there as part of the Human Diplomatic Mission support staff, low rank, the kind of person who carries things and stands against walls and isn't supposed to be noticed. My name is Vera Collies, and I want to be clear about that from the start. I'm not a diplomat, not a soldier, not anyone important. I'm just someone who was there, who saw it happen, who stood against the east wall for 7 hours on the day of the assembly, and watched something unfold that I still think about every single night. Let me tell you about the room first, because the room matters. The Grand Assembly Hall is enormous, not in the way a stadium is enormous, where the size makes you feel small and exposed, more like old. The kind of size that feels like it was built by people who understood that the conversations happening inside it would shape the fate of worlds, and they wanted the architecture itself to communicate that weight. The ceiling is 3 stories above the floor, and it's transparent, actual transparent alloy, not a screen, so you can see the stars directly above you. Not a projection, not a rendering, real stars. Real space, just a few centimeters of engineered material between you and the void. I've been in that hall a dozen times, and every single time I look up at those stars first thing. Can't help it. Something about seeing the actual universe overhead while empires negotiate underneath it. It puts things in perspective. The seating arrangement in the Grand Assembly Hall is organized by a complex protocol system that gets renegotiated every accord cycle. Delegations are assigned sections, and within sections, specific seats are assigned to specific individuals by rank and species adjacency compatibility, meaning you don't seat species with incompatible environmental markers next to each other if you can help it. The Karathi, for instance, prefer cold. Seat a Karathi delegate next to a Selvornian, and you've got a diplomatic incident before the opening address even starts. The day of the 312th Assembly, the hall was arranged in its standard semicircular configuration. 47 delegations, each in their assigned section, representatives in their species-specific seating. Some delegations had brought elaborate furniture from home. The Deveth always travel with their ceremonial memory chairs, which are basically mobile environmental systems disguised as furniture. Others made do with the station's standard seating, which is a mildly impressive feat of ergonomic engineering designed to accommodate most body configurations without causing injury. The Human Diplomatic Mission was in Section 12, middle left of the semicircle. Standard allocation for a mid-tier member species, not at the back, not at the front, somewhere in the comfortable anonymous middle. Ambassador Reyes was in the first seat, Deputy Ambassador Cho beside her, then the senior advisors, then a long line of aides and staff members arranged in descending order of importance. I was near the end of that line. From where I stood against the east wall, behind the last row of human seats, I had a decent view of most of the hall. Not perfect. The DVETH delegation blocked part of my sightline, and the memory chairs are tall. But I could see sections 1 through 20 clearly enough, and I could see the space that everyone in the room was very pointedly not looking at. Section 1. Selvorn Section. Let me tell you about the Selvornians, because, if you haven't had the particular experience of being in a room with one, you can't really understand what the atmosphere felt like. The Selvornians are, and I want to choose this word carefully because the usual words aren't quite right, old. Not just old the way civilizations are old the way the universe is old. Their homeworld, Selvorn Prime, predates most of the species in this hall by geological epochs. Their recorded history, not reconstructed from artifacts but actual continuous unbroken record, goes back 40,000 years. Their biological lifespan is effectively unlimited, barring violence or deliberate termination. The oldest Selvornians alive today were alive when humans were still arguing about whether fire was a gift from the gods or just a thing that happened when dry wood met lightning. Physically, they are unsettling in a very specific way that's hard to describe without sounding dramatic. They look almost human. That's the thing. If you glanced at a Selvornian across a crowded room, your brain would process person before it processed not quite right, and by the time the wrongness registered, you'd already be making eye contact, and that's a whole other problem. They're tall. Most Selvornians are somewhere between 1.9 and 2.1 meters, with a build that looks lean but moves like something denser. Their skin tones range from very pale, almost luminescent, to deep gray-black, depending on subspecies and regional origin. Their eyes are the part that your brain identifies as wrong most quickly. The pupils are the wrong shape, slightly too elongated, and the iris tends toward colors that don't occur in human eyes. Amber, silver, deep violet, red so dark it looks black until you catch the light right. And they're quiet, not just soft-spoken, quiet at a deeper level. When a Selvornian moves, they make less sound than physics seems to allow. When they breathe, you can't hear it. When they sit, there's no creak of a chair, no shift of weight, no small human sounds of presence. They simply are in a place, and then they are not in a place, and the transition between those states is so smooth it barely registers. They eat blood. I know that sounds like I'm veering into something that should be in a different kind of story, but it's a simple biological fact. The Selvornian metabolic system is incompatible with solid nutrition of any kind. Their entire caloric intake comes from a specialized biological compound found in the vascular fluid of most sentient species. They can process synthetic versions. The Galactic Medical Consortium has been producing Selvornian-compatible nutrition supplements for about 60 years, but there's a well-documented behavioral difference between Selvornians on synthetic nutrition and Selvornians on natural sources. The natural source ones are sharper, more present, more of whatever it is that makes a Selvornian. This is why you don't shake hands with a Selvornian diplomat unless you've been briefed and you're prepared for the full experience. The briefing, by the way, is 3 pages long and includes a waiver. The Selvornian delegation section in the Grand Assembly Hall is always Section 1. This wasn't assigned by rank or by protocol rotation. It's been their section since the station was built, by mutual agreement of all other founding species, because putting the Selvornian delegation next to anyone else created proximity discomfort that made the entire diplomatic process more complicated than it needed to be. Section 1 is at the far left of the semicircle, slightly separated from Section 2 by a gap that's officially listed in the station layout as an environmental buffer zone, but that everyone informally calls the dead space. Section 1 has 12 seats. On the day of the 312th Assembly, 11 of those seats were occupied. The 12th seat, the one immediately to the right of the seat occupied by the Vampire King of Selvorn himself, was empty. His name is Kaldur Voss. The Kaldur Voss, which is how people usually say it when they say it at all, with that particular emphasis that suggests the name has been said a certain way for so long that it's become its own kind of title. He's been the ruling sovereign of Selvorn for, and this number still does something uncomfortable to my brain whenever I say it, approximately 4,200 years. Give or take a century. He predates the Galactic Accord. He predates most of the political entities represented in the Grand Assembly Hall. He was already ancient when the first accord was signed, and he attended that signing as a curiosity, the station's records say, as an observer rather than a participant, because Selvorn wasn't a founding member. They joined the accord later, after several decades of negotiations so delicate that the diplomatic historians who study them tend to get stress lines around their eyes. I had seen images of Kaldur Voss. You can't work in galactic diplomacy without having seen images of Kaldur Voss. He's in history files, in threat assessment briefings, in the standard alien relations orientation package that every diplomatic staff member receives on their first week. But images and the real thing are not the same thing, and I want to be honest about the gap between them. He was sitting at the far left of the Selvornian delegation when I first properly looked at him. Second from the left in the physical seating, because the first seat to his left was occupied by his senior security advisor, a Selvornian named Torith who has the particular quality of making you feel watched even when you can confirm she's looking somewhere else. To Kaldur's right, that was the empty chair. He was dressed simply, for a king. Most of the sovereign representatives in the hall went in for elaborate ceremonial dress. The Deveth delegation head was wearing something that involved at least 4 different layers of memory fabric and 2 ceremonial energy staves. Kaldur Voss was wearing something that looked almost like a well-cut suit, except the material was wrong in a way I couldn't put my finger on, like it absorbed light slightly differently than fabric should, like it was a little bit more present than the air around it. Dark gray-black, fitted, no ornamentation except a single piece at his collar that I couldn't make out clearly at this distance. His hair was dark. His face was, I'm going to stop trying to describe it actually, because I've tried several times in several different reports, and I always end up either underselling it or going into territory that sounds ridiculous. What I'll say is this. He looked like something that had been around long enough to stop performing for anyone. There was no effort in his face. No expression put on for the room. Just presence. Just the particular quality that 42 centuries of existence apparently gives you, which is something like absolute stillness in a way that makes everything around you look slightly frantic by comparison. And to his right, that empty chair. I asked about the chair. This was early in the day, before the assembly officially opened, in the milling around period when delegations are settling and minor diplomatic exchanges are happening in the aisles. I found one of our senior aides, a man named Petros who had been on the Veyrath circuit for 15 years and knew everything worth knowing about the station's protocols and histories. The empty seat in the Selvornian section, I said. Section 1, right side of the king. What's that about? Petros looked at me, the way long-time diplomats look at people who have asked questions that seem obvious to everyone, except the person asking them. That's always empty, he said. Why? He paused, thought about how to explain it. You know the Selvornian biological proximity effect. I knew the basics. Selvornians emit something, the scientists aren't entirely settled on what to call it, but the working term is a biological presence field. which is a fancy way of saying that being close to a Selvornian does things to the autonomic nervous system of most carbon-based life forms. Elevated heart rate, heightened sensory awareness, something that sits between excitement and fear in a place that doesn't have a clean name. It's not harmful. It's not mind control. The xenobiologists have been very clear about that, partly because Selvornians find the accusation offensive and partly because it's actually true. It's just biology. Like how a storm front changes the pressure in the air, how you feel it before you see it. Being close to Calder Voss, being next to him, that effect would be more pronounced. For obvious reasons. He's the most powerful Selvornian alive. The field scales with age and biological potency. The seat stays empty, Petros said, because no delegation wants to put a representative in it. Being seated directly adjacent to the Selvornian king for a full assembly session, that's 8-10 hours, depending on the agenda. Most species delegates couldn't handle it. The proximity effect over that duration causes measurable stress responses. The Accord medical team has protocols for it. The last time anyone sat in that seat was about 40 years ago. Carathi Jr. delegate thought it would be a political statement about Carathi-Selvornian neutral relations. Had to be removed after 2 hours. What happened to him? He was fine, just couldn't concentrate, kept losing the thread of everything he was trying to do. The king didn't do anything, that's the thing people misunderstand. He didn't do anything, just sat there. The seat is empty because it's uncomfortable in a way that no one wants to spend 8 hours dealing with. So it's always been empty. At every assembly session in the last 40 years, yes. Probably longer, I'd have to check the records. It's just understood at this point. No one sits there. I looked across the hall at the empty chair. Dark material, curved back, one of the station's standard mid-ring diplomatic seats. Indistinguishable from the other 11 seats in the Selvornian section. Completely, entirely, unremarkably empty. Calder Voss was not looking at it. He was looking at the central dais, where the assembly moderators were arranging their equipment, with the particular quality of someone who has watched many things be arranged over many centuries and has learned to exist in the waiting without any visible impatience. I went back to my position against the east wall. The assembly bell sounded, and nothing was remarkable yet. The human diplomatic mission's support staff count that day was 37 people. I knew most of them at least by face. The support staff community in galactic diplomacy is not large, and Verath assignments repeat with enough regularity that you end up seeing the same people again and again across different postings. There were people I'd worked with for years, people I'd shared transit ships with, people I'd eaten synthetic ration packs with in various diplomatic facility break rooms across 3-star systems. I didn't know the woman in the gray coat. She appeared in our section during the morning recess, the first break of the assembly session, about 2 hours in, when delegates were permitted to move between sections for informal consultation and support staff were released to the service corridor for 15 minutes. I'd stepped out to the corridor, done the small necessary rituals of a break, water, a few minutes of quiet, the particular kind of silence that a service corridor provides compared to a room full of 47 species negotiating the future. And when I came back to my position against the east wall, she was there. She was standing slightly apart from the main cluster of human mission staff, near the far end of the section, holding a data tablet in one hand and reading from it with what appeared to be complete absorption. She looked like someone who'd been there for a while, comfortable in her stillness, not the fidgety stillness of someone new to a position, but the settled stillness of someone who knew exactly where they were supposed to be. But I didn't know her. I spent about 30 seconds running through my internal catalog of mission staff and coming up empty. She wasn't in my memory, and I have a good memory for faces. It's kind of a professional necessity. She was ordinary, in a way that's actually hard to describe. Not plain, not remarkable, just completely average in the specific way that means your brain doesn't know where to snag on her. Medium height. The gray coat was standard issue diplomatic support staff material, the kind that half the support people in the hall were wearing. Dark hair, cut short on one side and longer on the other, which I remember noticing because it's a style that was briefly fashionable about 4 years ago, and I hadn't seen it much recently. She had the particular quality of stillness that I'd noticed in veteran diplomatic staff, the learned ability to be physically present without being socially demanding, to exist in a space without requiring the space to acknowledge you. She was reading her tablet. She looked entirely uninterested in everything happening in the room. I asked the person nearest me, a young aide named Derry who had been with the mission for about a year, if he knew her. He glanced over. Oh, her. Yeah, I don't know her name. She came in with the secondary advisory team this morning. Think she's attached to the consul's office, something like that. She's been really quiet. She's been here all morning. I think so. I noticed her during the opening address. She was reading that tablet the whole time. I looked at the woman again. She turned a page on the tablet. Something about her bothered me slightly, the way a sound at the edge of hearing bothers you, not loud enough to identify, just present enough to register. I couldn't have said what it was. She was doing nothing unusual. She was standing in the right place, wearing the right clothes, doing the right thing, just reading. I filed it away. The assembly resumed. The morning session covered the standard agenda items, territorial boundary adjustments in the outer rim, resource-sharing amendments for the contested mining zones, a lengthy procedural dispute about the order of voting on species protection measures that took up almost 90 minutes by itself. I won't go through all of it. It's not why I'm writing this record. What I'm writing this record about started happening about an hour into the afternoon session. I noticed it because I was watching the hall generally, the way you do when you've been standing in the same position for 6 hours, and your brain starts cataloging everything in your field of vision just to stay awake. I've been tracking the DVETH memory chairs, which rotate slowly throughout the day as the DVETH delegates adjust their environmental settings, and I'd been watching the Karathi delegation's cooling unit, which makes a faint sound like distant bells every time it cycles, and I'd been watching the empty chair in Section 1. Not because anything was happening with it. It was empty. It had been empty all day. I'd been watching it for the same reason you watch a gap in a pattern. Some part of my brain had decided it was interesting and kept returning to it. So when the woman in the gray coat started moving, I noticed. She moved during the middle of a presentation by the Outer Rim Trade Commission representative, a DVETH named something I've never managed to pronounce correctly, while the hall's attention was mostly directed at the central dais. She moved the way she stood, completely, entirely without drama, just started walking, tablet in hand, heading toward the aisle that ran between sections. I watched her cross the aisle between Section 12 and Section 11. I watched her cross Section 11 without stopping. I watched her cross the dead space between Section 11 and the buffer zone. I watched her reach the edge of Section 1. My brain processed this in pieces, the way it does when something is happening that it doesn't have a ready framework for. First, she's in the wrong place. Second, she's still walking. Third, she's heading toward Oh. She walked into Section 1. The first thing that happened was that Torith, Calder Voss's security advisor, turned her head. I want to be clear about what that meant. Torith had been essentially motionless for the entire session, sitting to the king's left with the particular quality of present awareness that high-level Selvornian security personnel develop over centuries. I had been watching her intermittently and she hadn't moved. Not her head, not her hands, not her body orientation. She sat the way a statue sits, except a statue doesn't track things. When the woman in the gray coat stepped into Section 1, Torith turned her head. Her eyes silver, I could see them clearly even from the east wall, tracked the woman across the section. Torith's hand moved to something at her hip. Not a weapon, or not what we'd call a weapon. Selvornian security operatives carry various biometric monitoring and response devices, some of which don't have human equivalents but something. Her hand found it and rested there. The woman in the gray coat didn't look at Torith. She walked down the row of Selvornian delegates toward the empty chair. I don't know if anyone else in the hall had noticed yet. I was watching it happen, but I was against the east wall where I had an unusual sightline, and the assembly's attention was on the Trade Commission presentation, and Section 1 was at the far left, not in most people's direct eyeline. But the Selvornian delegates in the section, all 11 of them, had registered the intrusion. I could tell by the quality of stillness that had descended on them, which was a different quality than the one they'd maintained all day. Before it was a resting stillness, a neutral stillness. Now it was something alert, something coiled. The woman reached the empty chair. She pulled it back from the table slightly, just a centimeter or two, just enough to slide in comfortably, and sat down. Set her tablet on the table, and started reading. There is a sound that a room full of 47 diplomatic delegations makes when something unexpected happens, and it's almost no sound at all. It's the sudden cessation of all the small background sounds, the shuffling, the quiet murmuring, the environmental unit cycling, the stylus on tablet sounds, replaced by a held collective breath that you can feel more than hear. The sudden sense of the room paying attention. That's what happened. The woman sat down next to the vampire king of Selvorn, opened her tablet, and the grand assembly hall of Veyrath Station went very, very quiet. The Trade Commission representative, to their credit, kept speaking for about 30 more seconds before they also trailed off, uncertain whether they'd missed a signal to stop. The moderator on the central dais said something in Dveth that the translation system rendered as a query about whether there was an issue with the session. No one answered the moderator. Everyone was looking at Section 1. Well, almost everyone. The woman in the gray coat was looking at her tablet. And Calder Voss, I want to be precise about this, because I've gone over it many times in my memory. Calder Voss had turned his head. Not toward the woman, not yet. He had turned his head very slightly, a motion of maybe 15 degrees, in the direction of the empty chair that was no longer empty, like someone who has heard something at the edge of hearing and is orienting toward it without committing to the turn. And then he turned the rest of the way, and he looked at her. Part 3. What happens when something very old looks at something? I've spoken to 9 different people who were in that hall, and I've compared notes with all of them, and there is a consistent thread through all 9 accounts about the moment when Calder Voss turned to look at the woman. I'll tell you what I observed, and then I'll tell you what others said they observed, and you can draw your own conclusions about what was real versus what was the room's imagination running a little hot. What I saw, he turned to look at her. He looked at her for approximately 4 seconds, I counted, because something about the moment made me want to count, and then he looked away, back toward the central dais, forward, neutral expression unchanged. That's it, that's all I saw. 4 seconds of a very old and powerful being looking at a woman who had sat down next to him, and then looking away. What I felt during those 4 seconds, against the east wall of the Grand Assembly Hall, across the room from the Selvornian section, with 30 meters and 47 delegations between us. Nothing. That's what bothers me most, honestly. I felt nothing, because everything I had been told about Selvornians, about the biological proximity field, about the particular weight that comes from being in the presence of something genuinely ancient and genuinely powerful, all of that had primed me to feel something when Calder Voss did anything at all that seemed significant. And he looked at her, and I felt nothing unusual, and the air in the room stayed the same, and the lights didn't change, and the environmental systems kept cycling, and nothing happened. except that it felt from where I was standing, like something enormous and invisible had just shifted slightly in its course. Here is what the others told me about those 4 seconds. Petro's senior aide standing in the aisle between sections 11 and 12. I had my back to section 1, trying to signal one of the junior aides, and I turned around because the room got quiet. I saw him looking at her. What I remember is there wasn't any reaction from either of them. She kept reading. He just looked. But it felt like watching someone open a door to a room that should have been locked, and finding it already open. Derry, junior aide, standing with the main cluster of human staff in section 12. I thought we were going to have an incident. I thought whatever was going to happen was going to be really bad, and I was already running through the emergency protocols in my head. And then he looked away, and nothing happened, and I realized I'd been holding my breath so hard my vision had gone slightly gray. The deputy ambassador, Cho, from her seat in section 12. I've been in this work for 22 years. I've had Selvornian proximity experiences. I've been briefed thoroughly. I've done the training. I've never felt anything quite like the moment when he looked at her, because what I felt was absence. Like the room had been holding a charge for hours, the way rooms do when something tense is brewing, and in those 4 seconds the charge dissipated. I don't know how to explain that. I'm not sure I believe my own memory, but that's what I remember feeling. The DVETH memory chairs, I should mention, rotated 17 degrees simultaneously during those 4 seconds. The DVETH xenobiologists present later told us this indicates a significant environmental field shift detected by the chair's biological monitoring systems. They declined to specify what kind of field. Torith did not relax. I want to say this clearly because some accounts of the day have suggested that the Selvornian security advisor relaxed when the king looked away from the woman and went back to his forward orientation. She did not. Her hand stayed where it was. Her eyes stayed on the woman. Her particular quality of coiled alertness stayed fully coiled. But she didn't move, didn't intervene. This was significant. I didn't understand how significant at the time, but I've since been told by people who understand Selvornian security protocols considerably better than I do that the fact of Torith not acting was itself an action, a decision. One that, under normal Selvornian royal security protocols, should not have been her decision to make, that, under those protocols, an uncleared being entering the sovereign's immediate proximity should have been removed within seconds by the security detail. She didn't remove her. She watched, and the woman in the gray coat kept reading her tablet. I learned her name later. It's in the official record now, because the official record could hardly avoid including it given what followed, but at the time I just thought of her as the woman in the gray coat. Her name is Myra Solano. She's listed in the Human Diplomatic Mission records as a secondary cultural attaché assigned to the consul's office, which is one of those job titles that could mean approximately 14 different things depending on who assigned it and why. She had been with the mission for 8 months. Before that, from what the record shows, she had worked in deep space medical research for about 5 years, specifically in xenobiological compatibility studies. That last detail is something I've thought about a lot. At the time, though, just Myra Solano sitting in the chair, reading. The Trade Commission representative, taking their cue from the fact that the moderator had not declared a formal recess, cleared their throat into their translation device and resumed the presentation. The hall gradually, unevenly, like a held breath being released in stages, turned its attention back to the central dais. But not all of it. Not mine, not Torith's, not, I'd bet, the attention of any of the 11 other Selvornian delegates in Section 1. And not, though it was subtle enough that I might have been imagining it, the attention of Calder Voss himself. I need to talk about time for a moment. The rest of the afternoon session was 3 hours and 40 minutes. I know this because I counted every minute of it in my head. Or not counted, Exactly, marked. The way you mark time when you're watching something that might be important and you can't look away. For the first 20 minutes after Mayra Solano sat down, the hall was operating at about 70% of its normal ambient noise level. People were still whispering, still murmuring to their neighbors, still checking their diplomatic feeds for information about who she was and why she'd sat there and what it meant. I know this because I could hear fragments of it from the east wall. At 30 minutes, things had settled back to close to normal. The Trade Commission presentation had ended, the vote on the resource-sharing amendments had passed, and the next item on the agenda, a contentious debate about military vessel transit rights through the Selvornian corridor, was consuming enough of everyone's attention that the situation in Section 1 had been mentally filed under ongoing monitoring by most of the delegations. But monitoring was the word. No one had stopped monitoring. What were they monitoring? The woman sitting in the chair, reading her tablet. The king sitting in the chair next to her, attending the assembly. The space between them, which was, I'm trying to find the right word, charged isn't right, because charged implies something active, maybe weighted. The space between them felt weighted. Like the air there was slightly denser than the air everywhere else, though of course that was impossible. The environmental systems don't work that way. At the 45-minute mark, something happened. The military transit rights debate had reached a point of some contention. The Karathi delegation had submitted an amendment that the Selvornian delegation was opposed to, and there was a floor exchange happening between the two delegation heads through the translation system that had the particular quality of professional courtesy wrapped around profound mutual disagreement. Calder Voss was listening to this with apparent attention. And Mayra Solano closed her tablet, set it face down on the table, and looked up at the debate. That sounds like nothing. A person looks up, so what? But the movement, the closing of the tablet, the settling of her hands on the table, the angle of her head as she turned her attention to the central dais, it was so utterly normal, so completely, unself-consciously normal, like someone who'd been absorbed in reading and had finished the chapter and was ready to pay attention to the room. Next to her, Calder Voss did not move. But Torith's hand finally, slowly, came away from the device at her hip. I saw that. I was watching for it. And when it happened, that small motion, Torith's hand dropping to the armrest of her chair, the slight easing in the line of her shoulders, I felt something in my chest that I didn't understand for a while, and then eventually understood was relief. As if I'd been waiting, without quite knowing I was waiting, for something bad to not happen. The transit rights debate continued. At some point during it, and I'm not precisely sure when, because I was also trying to actually pay attention to the debate content for my own reporting duties, Calder Voss said something. He didn't say it to the room. The translation system wasn't engaged for it, so it wasn't in any official record of the session. He said it quietly, turned very slightly toward his right, in the direction of the woman sitting beside him. She didn't startle, didn't freeze. She turned her head toward him, just turned it, like someone responding to a colleague making a quiet comment during a meeting, and she said something back. I couldn't hear it. I was against the east wall, 30 meters of hall with 47 delegations in the way. I wasn't meant to hear it. But I saw it happen, and the person sitting to Mayra Solano's right, a Selvornian delegate whose name I later learned was Aviath, third in the Royal Advisory Council, turned very slightly toward them, and then turned very carefully back to the debate, with the precise quality of someone who has heard something that they are choosing not to appear to have heard. Whatever was said between them, it lasted about 20 seconds. Then they both looked forward again. The session continued. I looked at Petros. He was looking at me. We both looked at Section 1 and then looked at each other, and I knew we'd both seen it, and neither of us said anything. What was there to say? The second thing that happened was during the late afternoon break. The Assembly had a second recess scheduled at the 4-hour mark from the session's reopening, standard procedure, necessary because several of the delegations had physiological requirements that necessitated regular breaks from the hall's standard environment. The Karathi cooling units could only maintain comfortable temperature for about 4 hours before they needed servicing. During this second recess, the hall did something I'd never seen it do before. It didn't empty. Usually at recess, the delegations dispersed into the service corridors and the adjacent consultation rooms, the ones with species-specific environmental accommodations. Support staff retreated to break areas. The hall itself became mostly empty for the 20 minutes of the official recess, with maybe a few senior delegates staying to speak privately with each other before the room filled again. On this day, most of the delegation stayed. They didn't stay in the hall exactly. They moved to the aisles, to the outer edges of their sections, to the buffer zones. They distributed themselves around the edges of the space in the way of people who want to be somewhere without looking like they're being there on purpose. All of them were, at various angles, able to see Section 1. Torith had leaned over and said something to Calder Voss during the first minutes of the recess. He had listened without looking at her, then responded briefly. Torith had settled back. 2 of the other Selvornian delegates had, at various moments, glanced at Myra Solano the way you glance at something that you're trying to understand and haven't quite managed yet. Myra Solano was using the recess to make notes on her tablet. Her back was straight. She didn't look uncomfortable. I watched the Deputy Ambassador Cho navigate her way through the crowd in the aisles, apparently heading toward the consultation rooms, and then stop, change direction, find a position near the edge of Section 11, which gave her a clear sightline to Section 1. She pulled out her own tablet and appeared to be making notes. She wasn't making notes. I'd worked with Cho for 3 years. She didn't hold her tablet like that when she was actually writing. She was watching. The recess bell sounded. People settled back into their seats. Here's the part I can tell you exactly, because it's in the official record. At 16:42 station time, the Assembly moderator called for a procedural advisory submission from the Selvornian delegation regarding the Transit Rights Amendment. This is standard. When a delegation has objections to a proposed amendment, they're given the floor for a formal submission before the vote. The delegation head for Selvorn, a woman named C. Ravel, who served as Calder Voss's voice in the Assembly Hall because the king himself rarely spoke directly in plenary session, as a matter of protocol that was established in the original accord negotiations, and had something to do with Selvornian ideas about the appropriate use of sovereign speech, rose to the floor microphone. She delivered the submission. It was 10 minutes of careful, measured objection to the Transit Rights Amendment, citing 3 specific provisions of the original Selvornian Corridor Agreement and requesting amendment rather than outright rejection of the proposal. It was, by diplomatic standards, a reasonable and professionally delivered submission. At 16:53, the deputy head of the Karathi delegation requested counter time. At 16:54, before the moderator could grant the request, Myra Solano raised her hand. Not at the section floor microphone. She didn't go to the floor microphone. She sat in the chair in Section 1, in the space between the Selvornian delegation head and Calder Voss, and she raised her hand the way you'd raise your hand in a small meeting to indicate you had something to add. The moderator looked at her. The hall looked at her. She said, through her translation badge. Everyone in the hall wears a translation badge. They clip to the lapel and interface with the room's translation network, she said, in a voice that was clear and even and completely without drama. Moderator, the Human Diplomatic Mission notes that the proposed Selvornian amendment in Section 7, subsection C, mirrors language from the 280th Assembly's Corridor Agreement revision that was successfully adopted by 14 delegations at that time. The human mission supports the Salvornian delegation's amendment position. We'd like that noted for the record. That's it, that's what she said. 11 seconds plus the translation delay. The hall took approximately 4 seconds to process it. Then the DVETH memory chairs rotated simultaneously. All of them 14 degrees. And the Karathi deputy head sat back down. Let me explain the significance of that, because if you don't know diplomatic mechanics, it might not seem important. The transit rights debate had been, at its core, a tension between two blocks, the Karathi-adjacent species who wanted broad transit access through the Salvornian corridor for military vessels, and the Salvornian delegation who wanted restrictions and inspections. The amendment Sira Vel had submitted was a compromise position, modified restrictions rather than total rejection. The Karathi deputy's counter was going to be the opening of what could have been a 2-hour procedural argument about whether the compromise was actually a compromise or just a delay tactic. By citing the 280th Assembly Agreement, which I later looked up and which was, indeed, exactly the precedent she'd cited, with the exact language matching, Myra Solano had accomplished two things. She'd given the human delegation's formal support to the Salvornian Amendment, which shifted the voting math, and she'd framed the Salvornian position as procedural precedent rather than political preference, which changed the nature of the counterargument the Karathi would have to make. It was a very precise diplomatic move, the kind of thing that takes complete familiarity with 400 years of Accord procedural history. From a secondary cultural attaché, reading a tablet in a chair she wasn't supposed to be sitting in. The Karathi deputy didn't counter. The floor went to the vote. The Salvornian Amendment passed, 19-14, with 14 abstentions. At 17:03, when the vote result was announced, I saw Sira Vel look back along the Salvornian delegation toward the section where Myra Solano was sitting, and I saw something in that look that I can only describe as recalibration. The look of someone updating their assessment of a situation based on new information. Calder Voss was looking at the central dais. He didn't turn toward Myra Solano. But I was watching his hands. I don't know why I was watching his hands, some instinct or habit, and the hand on the table, the one that was on the side nearest to her, moved, just slightly, just a few millimeters, as if he'd reached toward something and then stopped himself. Or as if his hand had moved without his decision. I've spent a lot of time thinking about that. The assembly ended at 19:11 station time. Agenda items completed, 11 of 14. Remaining items deferred to the following session. The delegations dispersed through various exits, into the ring corridors, toward their respective accommodations and transport bays. The hall emptied with the particular efficiency of large groups of people who have been sitting in formal positions for many hours and want to move. I was one of the last of the human mission staff to leave, because I was gathering data on the vote records for the mission's nightly briefing compilation. A clerical task, but a specific one, and it kept me in the hall until almost everyone else had gone. The Salvornian section was empty when I finally gathered my materials and turned toward the exit. Almost empty. Calder Voss was still there. Standing, not sitting, he'd stood from the chair during the formal dismissal and hadn't moved to the exit with the rest of his delegation. He was standing at the table of Section 1, and he was looking at the chair. The empty chair, empty again. Because Myra Solano had left sometime in the dispersal and taken her tablet and her gray coat, and the chair was just a chair again. He stood there for about 30 seconds. I don't know what he was looking at exactly. The chair, or something the chair represented, or some thought that the chair had set loose in the 4,000 years of thoughts that a being like that must carry. Then he turned and walked to the exit, and he was gone. I stood in the emptying hall for another moment, looking at the chair myself. The cleaning units were already moving through the space, quiet automated machines resetting the furniture for the next session. One of them reached section 1 and began straightening the chairs, aligning them with the table edge. The empty chair, it got moved back an inch. I left. The next session of the 312th Assembly was scheduled for 2 days later. In those 2 days, the diplomatic halls of Veyrath Station were very busy, not because of the agenda, though there was certainly agenda business being managed, but because of what had happened in the hall, what Myra Solano had done specifically, what it had implied, who she was or who she might be, what the human delegation was signaling, if they were signaling anything, by placing someone with apparent deep accord procedural knowledge in the seat adjacent to the Selvornian king. Ambassador Reyes, I was told by Petros, received 17 separate informal diplomatic contacts in the 48 hours between sessions. Delegations wanting to know the same thing in 17 different culturally specific ways. Who is she? The Selvornian delegation contacted the human mission twice. The first contact was from C. Ravel, the delegation head, who requested an unofficial meeting with Ambassador Reyes. That meeting happened. I wasn't in it. What came out of it, per the brief Petros gave me the next day, was essentially nothing confirmable. Reyes confirmed that Myra Solano was attached to the human mission in a support capacity, provided her formal documentation, and offered no further elaboration. The second contact was from Torith. Torith did not meet with Ambassador Reyes. Torith requested a specific contact. She asked for a meeting with the secondary cultural attaché. With Myra Solano. That meeting also happened. I was not in it. No official record of it exists in the mission files, which is itself significant. What I know about it comes from Derry, who happened to be in the corridor when they emerged from the consultation room and who told me this. They came out and Torith looked like, I don't know. Like someone who'd gone into a room expecting one thing and found another. And Myra just looked like she always looks, you know, completely normal. They said goodbye in, I think, Selvornian. Myra said something in Selvornian, and Torith did this thing with her hand like this. He made a gesture I recognized as a low-contact Selvornian acknowledgement used between equals, not a subordinate acknowledgement, an equal one. Myra said something in Selvornian. I filed that alongside the xenobiological research history, the 10-minute procedural citation, the complete and utter unflappability of sitting next to a 4,000-year-old sovereign predator for an entire session. The day of the next session. Section 1 was arranged as always, 11 Selvornians, 1 empty chair. The assembly opened, the agenda was called, the session began. At 09:47, 12 minutes into the session, the woman in the gray coat walked into section 1. She sat down. She opened her tablet. She started reading. The hall was very quiet for about 15 seconds. And then the assembly continued, because the business of 47 civilizations does not stop for personal matters, even extraordinary ones. And the transit authority discussion moved forward, and the amendment votes were counted, and the moderators managed the queue, and the environmental systems cycled, and the DVETH memory chairs rotated gently in their mysterious DVETH way. But this time, after about 20 minutes, Calder Voss turned toward the woman beside him. Not the slight 15-degree turn. Not the look that lasted 4 seconds and then moved back to forward. He turned toward her, and he said something, and she looked up from her tablet and answered, and he said something else, and they talked for about 2 minutes while the assembly session proceeded around them, and Torith watched with her hand very deliberately not near the device at her hip, and the whole hall maintained the collective fiction that nothing unusual was happening in section 1. I couldn't hear it. I don't know what they talked about. Neither, to my knowledge, does anyone else. What I know is that when the conversation ended and they both turned their attention back to the assembly, there was something different about the space between them. Some of the weight had changed. Not lightened, not exactly, but changed into something that felt less like a held breath and more like a settled acknowledgement, like two people who have established between them some fact about each other, some basic fact, the kind of fact that takes a very particular kind of encounter to establish. I see you. I see you too. I should tell you what the official record contains. The official record of the 312th Galactic Accord Assembly notes the following. During sessions 1 and 2, a representative of the Human Diplomatic Mission occupied a position in Section 1 of the Assembly Hall, adjacent to the Selvornian delegation, in a non-standard seat assignment. The representative, listed as Secondary Cultural Attaché Mayra Solano, Human Diplomatic Mission, Consul's Office, raised a procedural note during Session 1 that contributed to the passage of the Selvornian Corridor Amendment. No incident occurred. The seat assignment deviation was noted and is under procedural review per Accord Section 14, Part 7 regarding seating protocol compliance. That's what the official record says. What it doesn't say is that by the third session of the 312th Assembly, the seat was no longer listed as empty in the seating diagram. It had been quietly reassigned. What it doesn't say is that Sira Vel, the Selvornian delegation head, personally submitted a request to the Assembly Protocol Office regarding the seat, and what that request said, and what the Protocol Office replied. What it doesn't say is that during the fifth session, when the Assembly broke for the late recess, Calder Voss and the woman in the gray coat were seen walking together in the ring corridor, and that Torith followed them at exactly the distance that Selvornian royal security protocols specify for situations of approved proximity, which is a longer following distance than restricted proximity, which means the approval was explicit, which means a decision had been made. By whom, about what, and why, that's what everyone wanted to know. What it doesn't say is that on the 8th and final session of the 312th Assembly, when the Selvornian delegation rose at the formal close to deliver the traditional closing address of the most senior delegating sovereign, a tradition as old as the Accord itself, Calder Voss did something that no Selvornian king had done at an assembly session in recorded history. He delivered the address himself. Not through Sira Vel, not through the official delegation voice. Himself, in the 17 translation languages of the Accord, through the Room's translation network, in a voice that I will not try to describe except to say that it sounded like something you hear once and spend the rest of your life carrying. He delivered the traditional closing and added, without any note in the prepared text, without any protocol submission, without any apparent forethought, 2 lines. I have them memorized. Everyone who was in that hall has them memorized. The Accord was built on the understanding that what we do not know about each other is more vast than what we do. Today I am reminded that the brave thing is not to bridge the gap in one great movement. It is to cross the first meter and see what is actually there. He did not look at Mayra Solano when he said it. He didn't have to. In the 6 months following the 312th Assembly, 3 separate xenobiological research teams published papers on the Selvornian proximity field and what they termed compatibility outliers, individuals from non-Selvornian species who showed atypical responses to prolonged Selvornian proximity. The research was theoretical, based on available data about the 312th Assembly's documented phenomena, because the primary subject declined to participate in any formal research. Mayra Solano declined 3 separate research team interview requests. I know this because I was asked to pass the requests along through mission channels, and I was the one who received her replies. Each time, a polite, brief, complete no. What the theoretical research concluded, working without her direct participation. There is a small subset of individuals, across multiple species, who do not respond to Selvornian proximity in the standard way. The mechanism is not fully understood. The leading hypothesis involves something about the particular calibration of certain neurological response systems, what the xenobiologists call proximity attenuation, a kind of natural dampening of the biological response that should, by all standard models, make extended Selvornian presence overwhelming for a non-Selvornian being. In simple terms, most beings experience Selvornian proximity as a weight that builds over time. For a very small number of beings, it levels off. They sit in the discomfort for a while, and then the discomfort reaches whatever their particular ceiling is, and then they're just there, present, not unbothered exactly but not overwhelmed. The Karathi Junior delegate from 40 years ago hit a wall. 2 hours was his ceiling. Myra Solano's ceiling, based on the observational data from the 312th Assembly, appeared to be approximately, well, the xenobiologists didn't put a number on it. The data ran out before she showed any signs of reaching it. I've tried, since the Assembly, to understand the smaller thing inside the larger thing. Because the larger thing, the diplomatic shift, the amendment victory, the closed session meeting with Torath, the change in the seating chart, the address, all of that matters in a big way that scholars and diplomats will analyze for a long time. The Selvornian-human diplomatic relationship was already one of the most carefully managed bilateral relationships in the Accord, and something about the 312th Assembly changed it in ways that are still being mapped. But the smaller thing, the moment I keep returning to, is not the address, though the address was extraordinary. It's not the Transit Rights Amendment, though that was impressive. It's not even the moment she sat down and the whole hall went quiet. It's the hand. The moment during the vote count, Calder Voss's hand moving a few millimeters toward her and then stopping. The smallest possible gesture. A motion that might have been involuntary, that might have been nothing at all. A body adjusting its position after hours in a chair. I think about what it takes for something that old to make an involuntary gesture. I think about what it takes for something that has existed for 42 centuries, that has watched civilizations rise and burn and rebuild, that has sat in this hall through 300 assembly sessions and watched the small beings of the galaxy negotiate their small agreements. What it takes for that thing to be caught off guard. To see something it wasn't expecting. To reach even just a little, without having decided to. 2 months after the assembly, I ran into Derry in a transit hub on one of the RIM stations. We were both between postings, both on layovers, and we ended up spending 3 hours in the transit hub's food service area eating something of questionable origin while the departure boards changed around us. We talked about the 312th. Of course we did. Do you know anything more, he asked, about her, about what happened after? Not really, I said. The mission's been tight about it. She's still listed as attached, but I don't know where she's actually based. Do you think she knew? He turned his cup around in his hands. Like when she sat down, do you think she knew what she was doing? I'd thought about this a lot. I think she knew, I said. I think the xenobiological research is relevant. If she knows she responds differently to Selvornian proximity, if she knows she can handle it, then she wasn't taking the risk that everyone else was taking. She was taking a different risk, a social one, a political one. She just knew something about herself and she used it. But why, Derry said. Why would a secondary cultural attaché, why would she do that? What's in it for her? I didn't have an answer. I still don't have an answer. What I have is a theory, and the theory is this, that the reason we couldn't understand what she was doing is that we were trying to understand it as a move, a strategic act, something done for something in exchange for something to get something. But what if it wasn't a move? What if she sat in the chair because the chair was empty and she wanted to sit down? What if she cited the 280th Assembly precedent, because she happened to know it and it was relevant? What if the conversation with Torith and the conversation with the king and all of it, what if none of it was calculated? What if she was just a woman who knew things and wasn't afraid, in a room full of people who were? Part 11, The Chair Now. The seating diagram for the 313th Assembly, scheduled for 8 months after the 312th, lists Section 1 as having 12 seats, all assigned. Seat 12A in the official chart is listed as Reserved Human Diplomatic Mission, Consul's Office. The chair is no longer empty. I don't know what conversations led to that notation. I don't know what was agreed, by whom, under what terms. Diplomatic agreements of that kind are not made on the floor of the Assembly Hall. They're made in the consultation rooms and the secure communication channels and the private corridors of stations like this one, in languages that aren't always the 17 official translation languages. What I know is that when I was assigned to the 313th Assembly support staff, and I arrived in the Grand Assembly Hall and looked at Section 1, the chair was already occupied. Myra Solano was already sitting in it. She had arrived early, apparently. She was reading her tablet. Calder Voss arrived with his delegation 12 minutes before the session opened. He walked to his seat. He sat down. His delegation settled. He turned his head toward her. She looked up from her tablet. She said something. He answered. It was so casual, so completely, utterly unspectacular. Two people who know each other settling in before a long meeting. On the other side of the dead space, 37 delegation sections full of representatives from 46 civilizations watched it happen with the particular quality of attention that the galaxy gives to things it is still learning to understand. The assembly bell sounded. The moderator called the session to order. The Deveth memory chairs began their slow rotation. And in Section 1, the chair was full. 11 years of diplomatic courier work, long transit flights, a lot of time to think. I think about the chair, obviously. It's been 2 years since the first time she sat in it, and I still think about it on long transits in the way you think about something that has genuinely shifted something in how you see the world. Here's what I've decided it was about. Not strategy, not biology, not even the particular courage of a woman who was unafraid of proximity to something ancient and powerful, though that's part of it. I think it was about the most basic thing in diplomacy, which is also the thing that diplomacy most often fails at. Presence. Not performing presence, not strategic presence, just being there, actually being in the place, actually looking at the thing that everyone else has decided is too uncomfortable to look at. Actually sitting in the chair that everyone else has agreed to leave empty, not because sitting in it is safe, but because the need for the seat outweighs the discomfort of occupying it. Most of us in that hall had learned to manage our relationship with the Selvornian delegation by maintaining a careful distance. Not hostility, not that. Just the particular professional distance that allows you to function. To treat the edge of something dangerous as a thing you navigate around rather than a thing you understand. She didn't navigate around it. She walked up to it and sat down. And what happened when she sat down was nothing dramatic, nothing terrible. The chair held her. The air continued. The session proceeded. A very old thing turned and looked at her and then looked away. And then, later, turned again and kept turning. The galaxy didn't change overnight. It didn't change dramatically. Diplomatic relationships shift in centimeters, not kilometers. And what shifted between Selvorn and humanity after the 312th Assembly is still shifting now, slowly, in ways that people closer to it than I am are better positioned to map. But the chair is no longer empty. And I think about that. I think about what it means when someone decides that the thing everyone else has agreed is too much, too difficult, too uncomfortable, too weighted with the fear of what might happen, is actually just a chair. Just a chair in a room at a table during a long meeting. And you sit in it. And you do your work. And you wait to see what actually happens, instead of what everyone has agreed to imagine might happen. I'm a courier. I carry things between places. I stand against walls and try not to be noticed. But sometimes, in the transit ships, in the long dark between stations, I think about Myra Solano sitting down in that chair the way other people think about other extraordinary things they've witnessed in their small, ordinary lives. Quiet, certain, reading her tablet. Not afraid. Not because she didn't understand the risk, but because she'd measured it. And she'd decided that the chair needed filling.